I have lived on Thresh Manor for 31 years. My parents brought me here when I was 4, in a colony transport that smelled of recycled air and someone else's coffee, and I remember almost nothing of the crossing except that my mother pointed at the belt through the viewport and said it was a wall. Not a metaphor, not a figure of speech, she meant it as a structural fact. The quarantine belt was the wall of our world, and everything on the other side of it was not our problem. She was right about the wall. She was wrong about the problem. I should begin somewhere useful. The belt is 14 light hours wide, measured at its narrowest traverse. It follows a corridor of deep space coordinates that no one has ever formally named because naming it would require agreeing on who owns it, and the answer to that question is the kind of thing empires have spent centuries carefully not asking. On our side of the belt, there are 11 colonies, 2 research stations, a waypoint fueling depot, and Thresh Manor, which is none of those things exactly. We are 3,812 people who live in pressurized warrens cut into the underside of a moon that orbits a planet with no formal designation. We mine trace deposits of a mineral the outer markets pay a modest price for. We grow what we can in our hydroponic bays, and we send a packet courier out once every 43 days to the fueling depot to pick up supplies and news, and the occasional new face looking for a quiet life. The belt is why we can have a quiet life at all. On the other side of the belt, there is the Veth absorption. There has been the Veth absorption on the other side of the belt for 307 years. They arrived in our records the way most existential facts arrive, gradually, and then all at once. The first survey drones that crossed back confirmed what the preliminary signals had suggested: a civilization of Gestalt mind structure, a web of shared consciousness that had been expanding outward from its core systems for somewhere between 400 and 600 years, absorbing every civilization it encountered, not by war, their diplomats would later explain, in a language that required 17 months to parse and another 8 to trust, by consensus, by the slow pressure of proximity and cultural saturation, until the absorbed species could not remember what it had felt like to think alone. The Veth absorption had integrated 31 distinct civilizations before they reached our belt. 31 species who had, each in their own way, eventually concluded that joining was easier than not joining. None of them had been human. I want to be precise about what the belt actually is, because in 300 years of living inside it, the colonies have accumulated a great many romantic myths on the subject. The belt is not a minefield. It is not a firewall. It is not technically even a designated exclusion zone, because that would require a full treaty. And formal treaties require 2 parties who agree the other party has standing to negotiate, and the absorption had been very clear in its early communications that it did not recognize individual consciousness polities as valid treaty partners. You could not sign an agreement with a finger, they explained, only with a hand. We were, in their terminology, pre-integration, which is to say, not yet absorbed, not yet real in the way they understood reality to work. What the belt is a corridor of deep space that the Veth absorption has been mapping for 300 years without crossing. They crossed everything else. They absorbed 31 species, but the belt they mapped. I asked my mother once why they didn't just come through. She was quiet for a long time. Then she pointed through the dome viewport at the smear of distant light that marked the outer edge of the belt, and she said, "They know something is in there." She was not a scientist. She was a woman who had been born in the colonies and had never left them, and had a settler's instinct for reading silence. She was more right than she knew. The thing in the belt is called, in official human records, Orbital Sentinel Platform 0, Designation Warden's Compact. The 0 SU in the platform number is not an administrative error, it means what it says. OSP-0 is the first of its kind, the original from which all later Sentinel-class installations were derived, and unlike every installation that followed it, it was never decommissioned, never mothballed, never stripped for parts. It was simply placed in the belt, at the belt's geometric center, 14 light hours from either edge, and left. Left is perhaps the wrong word. Entrusted is closer. I did not know any of this clearly until the day the absorption crossed. I had heard the stories the way everyone in the inner colonies hears them, as old gossip half buried under more immediate concerns. The mineral yield was down, the hydroponics bay had a fungal issue, the packet courier was 17 days late, and someone had started a rumor about supply disruptions at the depot. In the early years of my adult life, the belt was a backdrop, the way a mountain range is a backdrop. Always there, always the same, requiring no particular attention. The absorption mapped we lived. OSP0, a smudge on our passive sensors, an unresolved contact at the center of the belt, kept whatever it had been keeping for 3 centuries. Then, on the 307th year of their mapping, the absorption crossed. I was not at my sensor console when the alert came in. I was in the hydroponics bay, wrestling with the ventilation manifold that had been failing for 6 weeks despite 3 repair attempts, and the alert was not an emergency klaxon, only the soft ascending tone that meant the passive array had registered a new contact. I finished tightening the manifold fitting, wiped my hands on my work trousers, and walked to the control room at a pace that suggested I was taking the alert seriously without actually running. Because running, in the colonies, means you have already decided it is bad, and I had not yet decided. By the time I sat down at the console, the passive array had resolved the initial contact into 17 separate signatures, then 31, then, as the processing caught up with the raw data, 119. I sat with that for a moment. The absorption had never crossed the belt. 307 years, and they had mapped its edges, cataloged its approach vectors, sent survey drones to its boundary coordinates, and not crossed. I knew the colony administration had protocols, for if they ever did, every colony inside the belt had those protocols. Locked behind administrator class access I did not have. I knew the protocols existed the way I knew the deep space relay beacon existed, as infrastructure I had never needed to interact with directly. I pulled up the contact overlay and stared at what the array was telling me. The signatures were VETH absorption in profile. The colony had absorption signatures on file, because you study the thing on the other side of your wall the way you study anything that could kill you. Carefully and from a great distance. The drive signatures matched their survey class vessels. But these were not survey weights. Survey vessels mass between 60 and 400 tons and move in formations of 3 to 9. What the passive array was tracking now were vessels that massed between 800 and 4,000 tons, in a formation so tight the individual contacts were bleeding together at the edges of our resolution. I tapped open the colony's administrator channel and flagged it priority. The administrator on duty was a woman named Sev Thoral, 11 years senior, who had been running the colony's operations desk since before I had adult clearance. She looked at the overlay I shared, said nothing for 4 seconds, and then said, "Give me a count." I told her the array was still resolving. She said best estimate. I said hundreds. Maybe more. The resolution at belt center range was not precise enough for me to feel good about a specific number, but the signature density was unlike anything in our logs. I told her that. She said nothing again, for longer this time, and then she told me to watch it and let her know if anything changed and that she was opening the administrator protocols. I stayed at the console. The array kept resolving. The count climbed. At the 2-hour mark it was passing 3,000 distinct signatures. At the 4-hour mark it was above 4,000. They were moving in convoy formation, not battle formation, which I found oddly more frightening. Battle formation means you know you might be opposed. Convoy formation means you have already decided the territory is yours and you are simply moving through it. The convoy had the unhurried weight of a civilization that had never been wrong. I have thought about this often in the months since. The particular quality of that movement pattern, the tight efficiency of it, the way every vessel held its place in formation without the small deviations you see when a fleet is nervous. The absorption was not nervous. It had mapped the belt for 300 years. It had its survey data, its boundary assessments, its careful accumulation of electromagnetic readings that told it the belt enclosed pre-integration polities, nothing more. It had its record of the object at belt center, which said probable natural formation, mass estimate imprecise, and it had its 300 years of experience, crossing the boundaries of other species, and finding that the crossing was easier than anyone expected. The convoy moved the way confidence moves, the way certainty moves, the way a thing moves when it does not believe there is anything on the other side worth accounting for. I sat at my console and watched it come, and tried to tell myself that the belt had held for 3 centuries and would hold for this. I was not entirely sure I believed that. At the 6-hour mark something else registered on the array. I almost missed it. The something else was not a new contact in the way the absorption convoy was a new contact. It did not appear on the board as a signature that had entered from outside. It was an existing contact that had been on the passive array since before I had been born, cataloged under the heading Persistent Unresolved Contact, Belt Center. Last updated with a timestamp from 43 years ago, when someone had done a routine calibration sweep and noted that the unresolved contact at Belt Center was still there, still unresolved, and apparently not worth escalating. It was listed in the system with a mass estimate of somewhere between 12 and 80,000 tons. The range was that wide because the contact was at the center of the belt and the passive array's resolution at that distance was genuinely poor, and a radar cross-section that fluctuated so oddly that the system had long ago flagged it as likely a natural formation, a rogue body, or a dense debris cluster from some ancient collision event. At the 6-hour mark, the contact changed. It is difficult to describe in precise terms what changed, because the passive array was not built for this, and I am not a sensor specialist. What I can say is that for 31 years, whenever I had happened to glance at the persistent unresolved contact entry on the board, it had shown a flat, static return, the same faint signature, the same fluctuating mass estimate, the same stubborn refusal to revolve into anything identifiable. What it showed at the 6-hour mark was different. The return was no longer flat. It was moving, not in space. The contact was not translating, but spectrally, which is to say that the electromagnetic signature was shifting across frequencies, in a pattern that no natural body could produce. I called Sev Thorel back. She had already seen it. She had, in the 40 minutes since I'd last spoken to her, accessed administrator protocols I didn't know existed and contacted the Deep Space Relay Beacon, and the relay beacon had connected her to a signals address she described only as the coordination channel, and the coordination channel had told her 3 things. First, do not transmit on active spectrum frequencies. Second, seal the colony's exterior observation ports. Third, watch and log everything. I asked her why we were sealing the observation ports. She said, because what happens next is going to be very bright. She was, if anything, understating it. I know now, from the official records that were released to the inner colonies 18 months after the engagement, what OSP-0 Warden's Compact actually is. I knew fragments of it before, the way everyone in the colonies knows fragments, the old-timers' stories, the half-understood briefings that got passed down through colony administration hierarchies like an inheritance. Nobody wanted to think too hard about. But the full record is something else. The full record requires sitting with it for a while before you can hold it comfortably in your head. Warden's Compact was commissioned 340 years ago, which means it was already 33 years old when the Veth absorption first appeared at the far edge of the belt. It was built in a construction facility that no longer exists, from hull alloy composites whose specific formulations are classified at a level I do not have clearance for, to a set of specifications that were themselves classified until the record's release 18 months ago. The declassified specifications say that it masses 67 kilometers from bow to stern, which is a number I have read and reread because it does not feel real even now. 67 kilometers. The colony warrens that constitute my entire world fit inside its primary hull section with room to spare, and there are 11 more hull sections after that. The Warden's Compact's external profile was designed to read as debris, not as a ship in a debris field, as a consolidated mass of ancient collision material, the kind of dense rogue object cluster that appears occasionally in deep space as the long aftermath of some dead system's dissolution. The hull treatment suppresses the electromagnetic signatures that identify constructed objects. The mass distribution is irregular in a way that models natural aggregation. For 300 years, the absorption survey drones had passed within 2.5 light hours of it, logged it as probable natural formation, mass estimate imprecise, and moved on. For 300 years it had sat at the center of the belt and waited. There is a line in the declassified record that I have thought about more than any other. It is from the original commissioning brief, the operational mandate written 340 years ago by people who had no idea the absorption was coming. Because the absorption had not yet arrived, the line says, the function of the Warden's Compact is custodial. It does not interdict, threaten, or negotiate. It holds the line it is given until the line requires holding. The line required holding. I did not see it fire, because we had sealed the observation ports. I saw the data, and I have since read the sensor records from the belt's boundary monitoring stations. Passive arrays more sophisticated than ours that captured the engagement in far higher resolution than I had access to at my console on Thresh Minor. From those records, I can reconstruct what happened with reasonable confidence. Though I want to be honest about the gaps in my reconstruction, because the engagement was not a simple thing, and I am not a military analyst. The absorption convoy entered the belt at its eastern approach, crossing the boundary line at a bearing that would take them, if unimpeded, within 6 light hours of Thresh Manor and within 3 light hours of the Callaway Research Station on the belt's inner ring. The convoy was, at the time of crossing, composed of 4,412 vessels. The largest were bulk transport class, massing around 8,000 tons. The convoy was accompanied by a formation of 631 escort vessels, lighter hulled and faster, ranging in mass from 200 to 1,200 tons. 1,412 transports, 631 escorts, 5,043 vessels total. Convoy formation, I said earlier, not battle formation. What I mean by that is, they were not moving in the tactical spread that the absorption uses when it expects to be contested. They were moving in the tight, efficiency-optimized grouping they use when transiting claimed space. They had been mapping the belt for 300 years. They had recorded the contact at belt center as a probable natural formation. They had assessed the inner colonies as pre-integration polities, not combatants, not threats, not entities with the standing to resist. And so they crossed in convoy formation. Crossing in battle formation is a resource cost you incur only when someone on the other side of the line might actually stop you. OSP-0 Warden's Compact did not hail them. This is something the records are specific about and something I find, in retrospect, entirely consistent with the operational mandate. The mandate says the Compact does not interdict, threaten, or negotiate. It holds the line. A hail is a negotiation. It is an acknowledgement that the party being hailed has standing to respond, to explain themselves, to offer terms. The Compact did not offer terms. It held the line, and holding the line meant something different from what the absorption had been prepared for. The Compact activated its drive systems 4 hours and 31 minutes after the convoy crossed the belt boundary. The drive activation is what produced the spectral shift I saw on the passive array at the 6-hour mark. My timeline was slightly off because of the signal travel time from belt center to Thresh Manor, but the physics work out. The Compact had been reading the convoy's ingress for those 4 hours, cataloging every vessel, logging every formation parameter, building a complete engagement picture in the dark and the silence of its 300-year standby. And at 4 hours and 31 minutes it moved. The sensor records from the boundary stations describe its initial acceleration as 1,100 meters per second squared. For context, the largest VETH absorption transport in the convoy was capable of approximately 40 meters per second squared. The lightest escorts in the convoy's formation could do around 220. The Warden's Compact, 67 kilometers from bow to stern, classified for 300 years as a probable natural formation, accelerated at 1,100 meters per second squared from a standing start. It covered the 14 light hours from belt center to the convoy's lead elements in 11 hours and 19 minutes. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I want to be honest about what it felt like to watch the data come in during those 11 hours. We had unsealed 2 of the observation ports. Sev Thoral had decided that whatever the coordination channel had said about sealing them, we were colonists, not soldiers, and we were going to watch as much as we could see. The belt center was not optically visible from Thresh Manor at any useful resolution, so what we watched was the passive array data, supplemented by the occasional burst of hard data relayed through the boundary stations. We watched the persistent, unresolved contact belt center entry transform itself in real time from a static smudge into something the array's classification software had no category for. It tried large vessel, probable human reentry, and spat out an error because the mass estimate exceeded the software's upper bounds for that category. It tried space structure, type unknown, and logged it as a valid classification, which is the software's way of saying, "I have no idea what I am looking at, please consult an expert." No expert was available. We watched alone. During those 11 hours I did not sleep. I do not think anyone in the control room slept, or anyone in the colony who had access to the array feed, which by the 3-hour mark was most of the colony. Word had spread the way. Word spreads in a settlement of 3,800 people, which is to say immediately, and without any particular regard for the administration's preference for orderly information release. People came to the control room and stood behind the consoles and watched the overlay and asked questions I could not answer. What is that? Where did it come from? Is it going to stop them? I said I didn't know, and I said that as many times as people asked, and it was true each time. A man named Toveth, who ran one of the outer extraction rigs, asked me at the 4-hour mark if we should be getting the children to the deep warrens. I said Sevtharal had already done it. He looked at the overlay for a while without saying anything. He was 63 years old and had been born on Thresh Manor, which meant he had lived his entire life inside the belt without once being on the wrong side of something that required the deep warrens. He asked me if I thought the belt would hold. I said I did not know enough to have an opinion worth anything, he said. Your opinion is worth something, I said. Then yes, I think it will hold. He nodded and went back to watching the overlay. And I went back to watching it too. And neither of us said anything more about it. I checked the array's output against the absorption's known drive performance specifications 3 times in the first 6 hours, because I wanted to understand how long we had before the contact at Belt Center would reach the convoy if it maintained its acceleration. The math came back the same each time. 11 hours. Slightly more than 11 hours from the moment the contact had started moving, and it would reach the convoy's lead elements. The convoy, at its current velocity and formation, would be within 4 light hours of Thresh Manor by then. I ran the number and did not tell Toveth. There was nothing useful in that number for a man who had been born here and was watching the overlay with his hands in his pockets. What I could say was that the object was moving, that it had been sitting in the center of the belt for as long as anyone in the colonies could remember, and now it was moving, and it was moving toward the convoy. That the convoy, which had crossed in tight efficient certainty, was no longer moving as if it was certain. The signature behavior had changed. The lead escorts were repositioning. The burst activity between convoy elements had the cadence of something urgent being processed across a shared consciousness that was encountering something it had not prepared for. I watched the array during those 11 hours, and I thought about the 31 civilizations the absorption had absorbed. I thought about what it would have felt like to be on a survey ship from one of those civilizations, watching the absorption come across the boundary for the first time, and not having anything at Belt Center to watch come back. And I thought, this is the difference. This is what the belt actually is, not the corridor, not the distance. The thing in the middle of it that has been there for 340 years. Running dark, waiting, built to the specifications of people who understood something about what patience costs and what it buys. At the 7-hour mark of the compact's approach, I pulled up every historical file on OSP-0 that the colony's open access archive contained. Most of them were administrative. Status logs, maintenance scheduling records from the early decades, before it became clear that the compact did not require external maintenance, supply route notations that had been canceled in sequence as the belt sealed, and the colonies became self-reliant. The most recent substantive entry was a sensor calibration note from 68 years ago, written by an administrator whose name I did not recognize, who had noted that the persistent unresolved contact at Belt Center continued to present an irregular radar cross-section, and recommended that the designation be updated from probable natural formation to uncertain origin structure on the grounds that 3 decades of calibration sweeps had failed to produce a reading consistent with purely natural geological aggregation. The recommendation had been logged. The designation had not been changed. I found in one of the older administrative files a single paragraph that had been copied from the original installation briefing. Just a fragment, probably preserved by accident in a file transfer chain that no one had reviewed in many decades. It said, "The Warden's compact is not a weapon in the conventional sense of the term, meaning it is not a device for projecting force as an instrument of policy. It is a custodial installation, and the distinctions is meaningful. A weapon requires a decision to deploy it. The compact requires no decision. Its deployment parameters are fixed at commissioning, and its operational mandate is self-executing. The line is the belt boundary. The mandate activates when the line is crossed. No human authorization is required, and none should be sought. Because the scenario in which the line is crossed is by definition a scenario in which human authorization infrastructure may not be available." I read that paragraph 4 times during the 7th hour of the compact's approach. I thought about the people who had written it, who had understood 340 years ago That the scenario in which the belt was crossed might be a scenario in which the colonies inside it were no longer capable of making decisions, and had engineered accordingly. Who had not wanted the belt's defense to depend on someone being at a console, able to respond, able to authorize. The compact did not need me at my console. It had never needed me. It had been doing exactly what it was built to do since before I was born, and it would go on doing it long after I was gone. And the fact that I was here, watching, contributing passive sensor data to the coordination channel's engagement picture, was entirely incidental to whether the line held. I thought about my mother again. About the wall she pointed at when I was 4. At the 5-hour mark of the compact's approach, the convoy's outer boundary sensors would have been able to resolve its hull profile. I know this from the signal timing and the known capability specs of absorption sensor arrays. I know this because at the 5-hour mark the burst activity between convoy elements spiked dramatically and did not come back down, and the convoy's formation, which had been holding the screen configuration, began to spread. Not into a battle spread. Into something wider, more dispersed. The kind of spacing you choose when the thing bearing down on you is large enough that grouping together makes the targeting easier, rather than harder. The compact did not target them yet. This too is in the operational records, and it too is consistent with the mandate. The compact does not threaten. It holds the line. The convoy was inside the belt. The line was the belt. The compact was not moving to threaten the convoy. It was moving to remove the convoy from the line it was holding. These are different actions, and the distinction matters. Because threatening would have required some form of communication, some acknowledgement that the convoy had standing to be warned. The compact was not warning anyone. It was doing its job. The engagement began at the 11-hour and 19-minute mark. I know the precise timing because the boundary station records are precise. I know that the lead escort formation, which had arrayed itself between the compact's bearing and the convoy's main body, numbered 617 vessels at the time contact was made. I know that the engagement produced an electromagnetic environment across the belt interior, that the boundary station's hardened sensor arrays clipped on every channel for the first 40 minutes, which is to say that the boundary stations, built specifically to monitor high-intensity events, were receiving signal loads that exceeded their calibration ceiling. For 40 minutes, even the sophisticated instruments on the boundary, pointed at the interior of the belt, could not make precise sense of what was happening. They recorded saturation, and the saturation was its own kind of information. I know that at the engagement's 1-hour mark, the boundary stations began receiving individual signature returns again, as the electromagnetic wash settled enough to resolve individual contacts. The count at that point was 2,214 contacts, where 5,043 had entered. That number continued to drop throughout the 9 hours and 44 minutes of the total engagement duration. It did not stop dropping until there were 63. I was not at my console for all of it. That is a thing I want to be honest about. I was there for the first hours and the last hours, and I was in the corridor outside the control room for some of the middle, sitting on the floor with my back against the hull and my hands on my knees, trying to hold the information in my head without letting it become something I couldn't manage. The colony's children had been moved to the inner warrens by their parents hours earlier. The hydroponics bay was unattended. The extraction rigs were still running on automated cycle, pulling mineral from the rock below us, because no one had thought to halt the automated cycle, and it didn't matter, and the normalcy of that, the rigs still running, the automated systems doing their routine work while something without a category in our sensor software removed 4,980 vessels from the electromagnetic record. That normalcy was not comforting. It was just there, like everything that just keeps going. Sev Thorol found me in the corridor at some point during the middle hours. She sat down next to me without saying anything, and we sat together for a while without speaking, and then she said, I looked at the full administrator briefing, the one we're supposed to read when the absorption crosses. I said, what does it say? She said, it says to let the compact work. It says the belt will hold. It says to log everything and keep people calm and not transmit on active spectrum frequencies because the compact's engagement systems are frequency sensitive, and we don't want to put a source they haven't accounted for into the middle of what they're doing. I said, that's all it says? She said, there's a technical appendix. I didn't read all of it. The parts I read were about the compact's construction, the hull, The drive system. The weapons architecture. She paused. She said the weapons architecture. She said it the way you say something when you have read the words and understood them individually. But the combination has not yet settled into something you can hold comfortably. I said, how long has it been there? She said, 340 years. They built it before the absorption arrived. Before anyone knew the absorption was coming. I thought about that. About the people who commissioned it, who had looked at the geometry of deep space and decided that something needed to be at belt center, running dark, waiting for a line that might not need holding for a very long time, or might never need holding at all, who had built it to specifications they did not expect to need in their lifetimes, who had installed it and sealed the operational mandate and trusted that it would still be there when the line finally required holding, however many generations later that turned out to be, who had named it the Warden's Compact as if the name itself was a promise made to no one in particular to the future and its unknown requirements, to a threat that had not yet arrived. Custodial, I said. She said, what? I said, that's the word for what it does, custodial. It holds the line it's given. She was quiet again. Then she said, yes. We went back inside when the boundary stations began resolving individual contacts again in the post-saturation quiet. We stood at the consoles and watched the number drop. 2,000 and some, 1,400, 800. The number did not pause at any point. It simply descended, the way a count descends when something is working through it methodically, without hurry, without error, without any of the hesitations you see when a thing is doing something it finds difficult. The Warden's Compact did not find it difficult. It had been built for this, and it was 340 years old, and it was doing its job. There are Veth absorption survivors, 63 of them, from the 631 escorts. None from the 4,412 transports. The engagement lasted 9 hours and 44 minutes. 5,043 vessels entered the belt in convoy formation. 63 exited on the outer edge, on the side they had come from, at velocities that the boundary station sensors recorded as consistent with maximum emergency drive output. They did not decelerate at the belt boundary. They continued accelerating after they crossed back out, which is a behavior that makes no navigational sense unless you understand that they were not navigating, only running. The Warden's Compact did not pursue them past the belt boundary. The mandate does not include pursuit. The mandate is custodial. It holds the line it is given. The line is the belt, and the belt's boundary is where the holding ends. I watched the 63 survivors clear the boundary on the passive array. Then I watched the array's count of belt interior contacts drop to 2. The compact itself, now decelerating back toward belt center, and a cluster of debris signatures that the software was having considerable difficulty distinguishing from natural formation material. The debris signatures were consistent in mass distribution and electromagnetic profile with the remains of 5,043 vessels. I sat with that for a long time. Sev Thorel called me on the colony channel. She sounded very tired. She said the coordination channel had sent a message to all inter-colony administrations confirming the engagement was concluded, and that the belt remained closed, and that there would be a full debrief transmitted in the coming weeks. She said the message also included a commendation for the inter-colony passive monitoring networks. Our data and the data from every other colony inside the belt had contributed to the engagement picture. She said this with a flatness in her voice that told me she was not sure how to feel about being commended for watching. I told her I wasn't either. We sat on the channel without saying anything for a while. Outside the dome viewport, we had unsealed all the ports by then. Thresh Menor's sky looked the same as it always looks, which is to say faintly amber, faintly dusty, with the planetary body it orbits hanging large and pale on the horizon. The mineral extraction rigs were still operating. The hydroponic bay's ventilation manifold was probably failing again. 43 days from now, the packet courier would come and bring us news and supplies. And the news would be about what had happened in the belt, and the colonists who hadn't been watching it happen in real time would have to be told in person by those of us who had. I thought about what I was going to say to them. Then Sev Thorel said, "There is one more thing." I waited. She said, the coordination channel's message had included a technical assessment, a secondary note from the monitoring division. She was reading it while she spoke to me, and her voice had the particular quality of someone processing something that they do not quite believe. I said, "What does it say?" She said, "The The 63 survivors that cleared the belt boundary. The monitoring division tracked their drive signatures after they exited, as a standard continuity protocol, I said. And, she said, they didn't stop running. The monitoring division tracked them for 9 hours after the belt boundary crossing, until the signatures passed out of resolution range. In 9 hours, they had covered a significant fraction of the distance back toward absorption space. They hadn't decelerated, they hadn't formed up. The 63 ships were not traveling together, they were scattered across a dispersal pattern that suggested they had exited the belt at different angles and had not, since exiting, made any navigational corrections to group. They were just running, each one, individually, running as fast as it could in whatever direction it had exited. I thought about the Gestalt mind that had sent 5,043 ships into the belt in convoy formation, because it had decided the belt was unclaimed territory and its inhabitants were pre-integration, and the planet-sized object at belt center was a natural formation, and none of it would be a problem. I thought about what it feels like to think collectively, to share consciousness across a civilization of absorbed minds, and to have 63 fragments of that shared consciousness come across the boundary after watching what the Warden's Compact does to an armada that doesn't know what it is. I thought about the mandate, custodial. It does not interdict, threaten, or negotiate. It holds the line it is given until the line requires holding. I thought, 300 years. 300 years of mapping. 300 years of survey drones and boundary assessments and presence by proximity, all the slow pressure of a civilization that had absorbed 31 others and never once found a line it could not eventually wear down. 300 years of watching the belt and the thing at its center and deciding. Because the evidence supported the decision. Because the object was not flagging itself as a threat or a territorial marker or anything at all, only sitting there in the dark between the stars like debris, deciding that the belt was available, that the line could be crossed, that the first move would go the way all the other first moves had gone. The absorption had thought the belt was unclaimed. It had not occurred to them that a thing could be claimed without announcing itself. That a custodian does not put up signs. That 300 years of watching something not move is not evidence that it cannot. I told Sev Thorel, that's good, isn't it? The belt held. The compact held. She was quiet again. The kind of quiet that means the next thing she says is going to be something she has been trying to find a way not to say, she said. There's a second part to the technical assessment. I waited, she said, when the compact activated its drive systems. It activated them fully. All 12 hull sections, all drive banks. The electromagnetic output of a full activation at 67 kilometers is. The assessment's word was substantial. The word the monitoring division actually used, in the technical note, was significant with respect to detection. What they mean is that when OSP-0 Warden's Compact started moving, it announced itself across every spectrum that the absorption sensor arrays could read. Not deliberately. There's no indication of deliberate broadcast. It's simply what a structure that size produces when it activates from cold standby, the same way you can't switch on a fusion plant without generating heat, and heat is detectable, I said. So the absorption knows where it was, she said. They've always known where it was, more or less. Belt center, that's in their survey records. I said, what else did the activation announce? She said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I said it out loud so that it would stop being a thing I was only thinking. It announced us. The belt's electromagnetic environment during the engagement was, the monitoring division's assessment said, saturated across a wide spectrum band for the full 9 hours and 44 minutes. Saturated is the assessment's word. What it means in practical terms is that any passive sensor array operating within that saturation zone would have its data masked, all the fine-grained return signatures that a sophisticated receiver might use to distinguish, say, a colony moon with pressurized warrens and a small population and a passive monitoring array from background noise. Those signatures would be lost in the electromagnetic wash of a 67-kilometer warship, doing what it had been built to do. The engagement ended. The saturation cleared. The 63 absorption vessels that came out the other side of the belt had 63 sets of sensors that, once the saturation cleared, were pointed at the inner face of the belt boundary. The inner face of the belt boundary is the face that looks toward Thresh Minor, and the Callaway Research Station, and the 9 other colonies, and the Waypoint Fueling Depot, all of which were in the post-engagement electromagnetic environment, clearly visible. The absorption had not known we were there, not clearly. They knew the belt enclosed something. They had noted the inner colony electromagnetic leakage in their survey records, but the belt's geometry and the signal attenuation across its width had kept the picture vague. Pre-integration polities existed inside most territorial corridors the absorption had ever encountered, and pre-integration polities did not constitute reasons to alter strategy. What they had not had, until the engagement cleared, was a precise picture. They had one now. 63 ships running for absorption space, each one carrying a gestalt fragment of a shared consciousness that had just experienced something it could not categorize. Something the archive had classified as natural formation that had destroyed 4,980 vessels in 9 hours and 44 minutes, and not once communicated with them, and not once slowed down, and had then simply decelerated back toward its rest position at belt center, as if the whole thing had been a maintenance task. 63 ships running, and on their sensors, in the post-engagement quiet, the precise location of 11 colonies and 2 research stations, and a waypoint depot, and a small moon where 3,812 people have lived for 3 decades in the quiet behind a wall that turned out to be much thicker than anyone had told them. The coordination channel's debrief, when it came through on the relay beacon, confirmed what Sev Thoral had already told me in fragments. The belt had held. OSP-0 Warden's compact had fulfilled its mandate with complete effectiveness. The absorption had been repelled. The line remained the line. The debrief also recommended that all inter-colony populations begin voluntary relocation planning. Voluntary, the debrief said. Voluntary, and at the colony's own pace, with full logistical support from the relay infrastructure. The recommendation acknowledged that many colonists had generational roots in the inner belt communities, that the communities had legitimate grievances about displacement, and that the recommendation was not an order. The recommendation was not an order because it did not need to be. I spent the 3 weeks after the debrief helping people pack. Some of them argued at first. The compact had held, they said. The belt was secure. The absorption had been sent running. What was there to run from? I heard this argument many times, and I understood it, because I had felt the shape of it myself in the hours after the engagement when I had told Sev Thoral that the belt had held, hoping that was the whole of it. Toveth was one of the ones who argued longest. He had been born on Threshmanor, and his father had been born on Threshmanor, and he had a kind of proprietary feeling about the moon that I have come to understand better in the time since we left. It is not stubbornness, exactly, though it looks like stubbornness from the outside. It is the particular grief of a person who knows that the place they are defending is not defensible and cannot stop themselves defending it anyway, because the alternative is accepting that the life they have built means less than they believed. He stood in the control room on the second day after the debrief and argued with Sev Thoral for almost 2 hours about whether the recommendation constituted sufficient grounds to abandon 11 colonies, 2 research stations, and a fueling depot that had taken 3 generations to build. Sev Thoral was patient with him. She had been patient with everyone during those weeks, which I think was the hardest thing she did, because she was the person who had read the technical appendix. Eventually Toveth went quiet. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the passive array overlay, at the persistent unresolved contact that had become large vessel, human researchery, classification restricted sitting at belt center, and he said, "It's going back to sleep, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes. It's going back to standby. It'll be there," he said. "It'll be there for the next time." I said, "Yes." He said, "Good." Then he went and started packing. The packing was not quick work. 3,812 people have accumulated a great deal between them over 3 generations. And deciding what to take when the transport allowance is limited is the kind of decision that excavates what people actually value as opposed to what they believe they value. I helped a woman named Leth Orvan carry 40 years of ceramic pottery, her own work, pieces she had fired in the colony kiln, down to the transport pad, and then help her decide which 6 she could take, which 34 had to stay, she cried. Not dramatically, just the quiet, steady kind that happens when someone is doing something practical, and the grief finds the gap. I did not say anything useful. I carried the pieces she was leaving back to her workroom, and set them on the shelves, and thought about the fact that they would still be there, on those shelves in that room, in sealed warrens on a moon that no one would be living on, for as long as the structure held, which might be a very long time. The Warrens were built to last. We built things to last in the inner belt because the packet courier came every 43 days, and replacement parts were not a convenience we could rely on. The hydroponics manifold would fail again eventually, with no one to fix it, but the Warrens themselves, the rock they were cut from, the airlocks and the pressure systems and the walls, those would hold for a long time after we were gone. A long time after the last heat signature from our life support had faded from anything a sensor array could detect. The 63 absorption survivors had had a clear picture, a precise picture, but what they had seen in the post-engagement quiet was a moon, not a threat, not a fortification. A small colony moon with heat signatures, consistent with 3,812 people doing what people do. Whatever the absorption's collective consciousness concluded about the belt and its custodian, it would know that the interface of the belt contained soft targets, pre-integration polities, in their terminology, things that could be absorbed, eventually if the approach to them was different from a convoy through the belt. The debrief did not say this. The debrief was careful not to say this, because the debrief was also a document meant to convey the recommendation for voluntary relocation, and a document that says your home is now a soft target is not a document that produces orderly voluntary decisions. But I had read the technical assessment. I had spoken to Sev Thoral. I understood what the post-engagement electromagnetic environment meant, and what 63 ships running with clear sensor pictures meant, and what a civilization that had absorbed 31 species by the slow application of proximity and presence would do with a precise catalog of exactly who was on the inner face of the belt. But the belt had never been the problem. The belt had always held. The compact had always been there, holding it, and none of the 3,812 of us had known clearly enough what that meant to make the decisions we might have made differently. We had lived here because the belt was safe, and the belt had always been safe, and we had understood the belt's safety as a fact of geography the way you understand a mountain range as a fact of geography, without needing to think too hard about what mechanism enforces the geography. The mechanism had announced itself. The mechanism had lit up across every spectrum for 9 hours and 44 minutes, and in the quiet afterward, 63 ships full of a Gestalt mind that had just watched 4,980 of its vessels destroyed had gotten a very clear picture of what was on the far side of the belt's wall. And those 63 ships were running back to a civilization of shared consciousness that would integrate what they had seen, process it, distribute it across however many billions of absorbed minds constituted the absorption's total collective thought, and arrive at a conclusion. The conclusion would not be another convoy. That much was clear. The conclusion would be something else, eventually. And when the something else came, it would come at the belt, and the compact would hold the line, and we would be on the wrong side of that line. There is no good way to leave a place you have lived your entire conscious life. There is the logistical version of leaving, which is manageable. You inventory your possessions. You book passage on the transport the coordination channel sends. You seal the Warrens and hand the access codes to the administration. You file the relocation paperwork that entitles you to a settlement grant in the outer colonies. There is the inventory version of leaving, and then there is the other version, which is not logistical, which is the version where you stand in the hydroponics bay you have been tending for 11 years and look at the rows of plants that are going to die, because no one will be here to manage them, and you try to understand what it means that the belt is still holding, and the line is still the line, and you are nonetheless being asked to leave. I stood in the hydroponics bay the morning before I was due to load my kit onto the transport. It was the same bay where I had been wrestling the ventilation manifold when the first alert came in. The manifold was still failing. I had fixed it twice in the 3 weeks since, and it had undone both repairs, which is the kind of thing the manifold had always done, the kind of small, persistent failure that gives a life texture. The plants did not know there was anything wrong. The lettuce was healthy. The grain crop was 2 weeks from harvest, and would not be harvested because there would be no one here to harvest it. I stood there for a long time without touching anything, because touching things felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make. Then I picked up my tools, tightened the manifold fitting one final time, and left. I left on the third transport. 47 other colonists left with me on that transport, the ones who had been slowest to decide, or the ones who had the most to sort through, or the ones who had simply needed a little more time to stop arguing that the belt was secure and start understanding that secure and safe are not always the same word. We lifted out of Thrushmonore's gravity well on a clear amber morning, and I watched the surface drop away through the transport's narrow viewport, the extraction rigs, and the dome, and the pressurized warrens that 3,812 people had called home. We crossed the belt on the relay route, which passes through the belt in a tracked corridor that OSP-0 is calibrated to recognize. This information was in the colonist briefing. It did not make the crossing comfortable. The belt's center contact appeared on the transport's passive display as the same persistent unresolved contact that had been on Thrushmonore's array. My entire life resolved now. The transport had better sensors than our colony array, into something the software categorized as large vessel, human reshadry, classification restricted, 67 kilometers long, sitting in the belt's center exactly where it had always been, running dark, its electromagnetic signature suppressed, its drive systems in standby. It had not moved since the engagement. It was simply there, in the dark, the way it had always been there. 340 years old, sitting at the center of a 14 light-hour corridor, holding the line it had been given. No one on the transport spoke while we were in the belt. Not because there was anything to say, but because there wasn't. I thought, as we crossed, about the Veth absorption, about what the Gestalt mind was doing now, with the information its 63 survivors had carried home, about the 31 species it had absorbed, and whether any of them had been warned, and what kind of warning could have made a difference, about the survey drones that had been mapping the belt for 300 years, logging the contact at belt center as a probable natural formation, moving on, about what it meant to be a civilization that thought collectively, that shared every sensation and conclusion across billions of connected minds, and to have 63 of those minds come home carrying the memory of 9 hours and 44 minutes of the Warden's compact at work. The absorption knew what was in the belt now. The object that had been probable natural formation was something else entirely, and they knew its capabilities with the precision of direct experience. What they did with that knowledge was their own calculation to make. Whatever they concluded, the belt would hold. The compact would be there. We would not. I thought about my mother, about the amber sky through the dome viewport, the wall she pointed at when I was 4 years old, and she said, "That is the wall of our world." She was right about the wall, and she was right that everything on the other side of it was not our problem. She just never considered that we might one day become visible to the problem, that the wall being held, being exactly what it was built to be, might be the very thing that made us findable. The belt held. The line held. The compact held the line it was given. In 9 hours and 44 minutes, against 5,043 ships, without negotiating, without threatening, without once acknowledging that the convoy had standing to be warned. And we packed our things and left in the quiet afterward, because that is what you do when the thing that kept you safe does its job so completely that the keeping becomes the problem. 3,812 people, 11 colonies, 2 research stations, a waypoint fueling depot, a small moon with a hydroponics bay and a passive sensor array and a ventilation manifold that always needed fixing. Gone now. The warrens are sealed. The rigs are dark. And somewhere at belt center, in the long silence between what happened and whatever comes next, the Warden's compact holds the line. It always will.